Chapter 103. I was taken to the hole but later released back to population after my ex-girlfriend's uncle intervened. He went to the victim hospital bed and threatened to have him sent to Lawton if he didn't change his statements and proclaimed that I was innocent. He didn't stand a chance in Lawton because he would be labeled as a snitch for giving up the names of his assailants. He immediately did it and begged for forgiveness for naming names. He wasn't granted that. The next day after I got back to population, a one-on-one fight broke out and one of the culprits was a homie. He pulled a knife and chased his adversary, cornering him into a corner where the showers were. He began pushing a knife into the rival, causing blood to shoot all over the chair, along with loud screams, which alerted the officers. One officer ran out the bubble with a can of mace. Before he could shoot it at the homie, I knocked it out of his hand. He stood there stunned. Mind your business. He ran back into the bubble waiting for backup officers. Once they came, we were all taken to the hole and the victim was taken to the hospital. I was given a disciplinary report for assaulting an officer and interfering with an officer's duties. This was my third time going to the hole and the second time in a week. I was then placed on permanent lockdown, but they let me keep my crayons. Generally, I very rarely used the phone or got visits in jail. I prefer not to have them, but an associate would come and check on me sporadically. She wasn't intimidated by the FBI. She had already gotten fired as a tax attorney from the law firm that she worked after the FBI harassed the firm about her connections to us. She gave me updates on the temperature of the streets. I was on permanent lockdown in a hole, so I had no idea what was going on except through guys just coming to the hole from population or society. One homie in there had just gotten 5 life sentences for conspiracy. And while in court, he overheard the prosecutor speaking of a coming racketeering indictment against the First and Kennedy Street crew. He heard my name being mentioned. My associate told me they had raided most of my family members' homes and the Jamaican military even went to my grandparents' home. The Rastafarians had a community in Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian authorities had been snooping around and even searched my associate's home in Addis Ababa without a warrant. She said my brother was in Kenya, but disappeared after the Kenyan military became aware of his whereabouts. She also said the Saudi Arabian embassy had alerted the US authorities that he had acquired a visa from them, which pushed the US to expand their investigation, which led them to finding out about 3 different aliases that he used. They were on his trail, but he was far ahead of them. I also hadn't heard from my mom in months because the feds had began putting intense pressure on her. She also had to disappear. My mom was a Rastafarian and a follower of Black Panther ideology. She used to sometimes dress in fatigues and black and red beret. My associate believed my mom was in Uganda, living amongst the pygmies. And my pops was somewhere in the tropics. She believed somewhere in Belize. Chapter 106. Crews. Since the late 80s, the DC government were using an effective weapon to combat the powerful street crews. It was called CCE, Continuing Criminal Enterprise, Federal Conspiracy, and the RICO law. The Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act was commonly referred to as the RICO Act, or just RICO. It was supposedly named after a character named Rico, played by Edward G. Robinson in the 1930s gangster film Little Caesar. It enabled prosecutors to tie numerous crimes committed over a period of time, all together into one big case. This doctrine was signed into law in 1970 by President Nixon, who should have been the first person charged with it. It was in an effort to combat the Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Russian mafia. The first time this law was used was against the Hells Angels biker gang in 1979. They were all acquitted. The government then primarily focused the RICO Act on the Italian mafia all over the country, but specifically the heads of the 5 mafia families in New York. The first major RICO conviction was of the head of the Genovese family in 1980. By 1986, the feds had RICO cases pending against 17 of the country's 24 families. They were all convicted and sentenced to life or 100+ years. But RICO was now being used to target young black Americans. Italian, Russian, Irish, and Jewish crime bosses that were charged with RICO all had at least a 20-year pattern of criminal activity. They were usually in their 50s and 60s. But the black Americans that they were now targeting with the RICO Act were usually in their 20s. Some were still teenagers. One of the first people they tried it on was the Linwood Gray organization in the late 70s. It was a $30 million international heroin smuggling network with ties from Amsterdam, Zurich, Montreal, Chicago, and DC. Linwood was acquitted on the CCE counts in the 56-count federal indictment and only convicted of tax evasion. This embarrassment caused the government to hesitate on using the CCE and RICO cases. 10 years later, in 1989, they decided to try it again. This time it was on Rafer Edmonds' organization based in Northeast DC. They were teenagers up to their early 20s. The leader, Rafer, was only 24. When they were arrested, most of us were too young to understand what those charges meant. We all thought that if you wasn't caught with any drugs, money, or guns, it would be extremely hard to get a conviction. Rafer's case proved us all wrong. He wasn't caught with any contraband but was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. The rest of his crew were all sentenced to hefty sentences also. Soon after that conviction, the government arrested 24 men on a $50 million conspiracy from the R.I.C.O crew. They were also from teenagers to their early 20s. They were acquitted of all the RICO counts but found guilty on the CCE counts and sentenced to life. Within months, they arrested 15 men from the P Street crew, again in 1991. But this case gave us all hope as the case fell apart and they were all given plea bargains for under 12 years. But the government was just getting started. They had already taken over 100 men and women off of the streets with these federal charges, and they had their sights on thousands more. They started in Northeast and then began working their way up to Northwest, the exact trajectory of the gentrification process. Though DC had dozens of crews, the government only focused on a small set. From Northeast to Northwest and over to Southwest and Southeast, crews of young black men were being picked up on RICO charges, with neighborhoods being wiped out and homes being seized to make way for the rich Europeans to move in. And we were unintentionally aiding and abetting them while being totally naive to the master plan. Before 1991 was over, they arrested 12 more young men from the Newton Street crew on a 61-count RICO indictment. All the defendants were convicted and most of them were given double and triple life sentences. This gave the government the hope that they needed after the P Street debacle. So the following year, they arrested 4 men on a 26-count RICO and CCE indictment from the First Street crew, again in Northwest. All 4 were convicted and sentenced to life. The leader was 20 years old and his lieutenant was a 19-year-old kid. Under the RICO statute of committing at least 2 acts of racketeering activity within a 10-year period would mean they began investigating them at the age of 9 and 10 years old. Even if it was a 5-year period, it would be 14 and 15. The feds were now targeting black children. The next year, 13 young men from the Fern Street crew, again in Upper Northwest, were convicted of racketeering and CCE and mostly sentenced to life. And now with their newfound inspiration and winning record, they had their sights on us. Also in Upper Northwest, the First and Kennedy Street crew.